So we're working today for Workforce Go editing a timesheet, and I'll be recording the session for today. So for those of you who are here now, you can always use this session to go back and listen to it, or we can play it back for those who've missed it or want to see it later. So the agenda I have today, we're going to go through the payroll process. So we're all probably familiar already with when our timesheets are due and stuff, but a lot of the perspective I have for Workforce Go is how this information gets from Workforce Go into Intact for accounting purposes. We'll look at viewing employee timesheets, which most people here probably can view on, but we're going to cover a couple highlights I do from the reports class I offer for Workforce Go. So if you're not too familiar with creating your own report, that process is the same, whether it's for a timesheet, a pay statement, or other areas of Intact. And then we'll actually get into editing timesheets, adding time, splitting, distributing time across multiple cost centers, changing cost centers. And then the big one, I think that the comments I had on the registrations were a lot of people are interested in mass editing. So we'll go through that at the end. And then if there's time, there is a little thing about requesting leave on behalf of an employee that I wanted to show if we haven't done that yet. During this, if you have questions, on the screen, the bottom right, there should be a chat box. So please feel free to use that at any time, and we can answer questions as we go along. So I'll be keeping an eye out for any questions in the chat box. So the payroll process functionally just works like this. Our pay period that we're currently on is from April 15th to April 28th. And during this process, timesheets are generated, work hours are being processed, leave is being granted, submitted, change requests, all that stuff is happening to produce data from our timesheets. And on April 29th, day after the pay period is over, the timekeepers, supervisors, directors all have a responsibility for finalizing timesheets to get them ready for payroll. And so that's making any last minute adjustments that has to be made, things like that. And then the next day on Friday, payroll actually gets processed. So typically Friday morning, our payroll department will collect the timesheets as they are and begin processing payroll. And this allows us enough time to actually fund the payroll bank account, since it's all comes from one bank account. By getting the time processed on Friday and getting paychecks ready, this allows us to do drawdowns of grants and get funding into the payroll account so that the next week when we actually get paid, we have the funds to cover our pay. So everything we talk about contributes to this process here and ultimately affects that. So if we don't have our timesheets ready on April 29th and we decide that we're going to edit them late in the morning on April 30th or in the afternoon, there's a possibility that the timesheet will be processed for what it was Friday morning, not what it is Friday afternoon. And so this creates a situation where payroll will have to reissue a check to correct those changes that have happened. And we can see that happen like a few dozen times a payday. So hopefully this session will help with managing some of those changes that we have or that we might struggle with, especially the mass editing part. So the payroll process, any changes to timesheets after payroll has started may result in the original timesheet being processed and the edits may not be included. The data posted to Intact from Workforce Go relies heavily on how our timesheets are prepared, how an employee's profile is set up, and when the setup was put into place. So we do get questions, why was a certain employee's payroll charged to this funding source but not the other funding source? And most of it's going to be about our timesheet. So this is what we hope to address. And the personnel actions, of course, drive how an employee is set up. So when a PA is processed for an employee, it triggers the need to update where an employee gets paid from. It could be a funding source, program if they've transferred jobs. When the cost center info is updated, the update begins with the next payroll entry or timesheet entry. It doesn't go backwards and update stuff. So if today our PA is processed and the program monitor updates your funding source, their timesheet entries that have gone on leading up to today do not update. So it'd be the responsibility of the program to make sure we change the cost center on our timesheets. And this might happen if we change funding sources because our grants are changing from FY20 to 21. We just did that with Head Start when their fiscal year ended March 31st and started April 1st. Others work within the tribe's fiscal year, so we may have those changes during that time. So we're going to move off of the PowerPoint and we'll actually get into Workforce Go now. So the first part I want to look at is just viewing an employee's timesheet. Which we come up here to the 3 lines, it opens our menu tab. And we have our options for favorites, my info for just your own Workforce Go information, where you look at your own timesheet, request leave, that kind of stuff. We'll be spending most of our time today in the team section where it has the double silhouette. And we're going to open time sheets, and we're going to go to all timesheets. So I think everything we're looking at today, I have a default view where it's just my stuff. But depending on what you have access to or the employees assigned to you, you would see a list of your employees' timesheets for this. So the default thing that we see on all timesheets is it starts this month. So if we were looking for the month of March, we're certainly not going to find it listed here. And if I wanted to find a timesheet start date and I use a February date, it would come up blank because this is selected just to only show this month. So we can be aware of that when we come to all timesheets. And we can start to filter to make changes. If we wanted to change the period of time that the timesheets are going to display, we can click up here and choose from different calendar ranges. Do we want to see this year, meaning this calendar year, this quarter, past periods of time, future, stuff like that. So you can make those changes to affect what's going to populate here. So if I went to this quarter, for example, and applied that, we're on the second quarter of the year starting April, so it would only show us this current quarter's timesheets, which happens to match this month. Or if we wanted this year, and now here's the handful of timesheets I've had that have happened in 2021. And so for those of you who have a lot of employees assigned to you, you do something like this, you might get more than the 10 rows I have up here. You may have, depending on the number of employees, a couple of dozen rows or more. But this would be an easy, fast way to find a number of timesheets for your employees. And of course, we don't see the timesheet information from this point perspective, but this gives us the initial chance of looking at timesheets. And what I want to talk about with the report generation is, so I made this my default view, right? It's for this month, specifically for me. And you can do that for any of your staff. You can select a one person or more, depending on their name combinations here. We can go to filter, and from all employees, we can browse and start picking people to build a list. So if we wanted to look at timesheets based on people who work during the day or evening or night, you're able to build your timesheet by grouping those people together and adding them to your groups to make these timesheets. You can, whatever way would fit for how you want to look at this. We can add more columns to our timesheets. So on the upper right corner, there's these three dots. And there's an option we all have called Add Remove Columns. And so we come here. On the left side, we get a list of available columns. And on the right side are the current columns that are on display now. So if there was other information we wanted to see when we come here, admin leave, regular hours, sick leave, that kind of stuff, we can type the word sick and it will display to us every option available to us where the word sick is available. So if I wanted to know time off by sick or work hours, hours by, I could add that to these timesheets report here and have that sit next to calculated hours. So it's a quick way of me looking at and seeing like leave usage for our employees in our departments or admin leave use, that kind of stuff, as a summary of people's timesheets. And in this case, for this month, it would give us a summary of my timesheets. So if I wanted to add regular hours to sit next to that calculated hours, I can select calculated hours by regular, add it to comes to current columns, and I can reorder it with this arrow here by using the checkbox. Maybe I want that right next to the calculated hours total. And when I hit apply, the sheet will update, and now it adds regular hours to my timesheet. And so if this was what I wanted to see, and I don't want to have to build this every single time I come back here, when we go back to these actions buttons, we have save view and save view as. And so if I wanted to save this view as something else, I can give it a name. If I want it to be my default option, so every time I come to all timesheets, this is the thing that will pop up, I can make it my default. And so I don't want it to be my default. I like the training one there. So I'm gonna click save. And this view will be available as one of the options I have to myself, where I can go back and forth between different things I've saved. So I might have one for regular hours, maybe I'd have a different one for sick, or I'd put it all together on one. But a quick way of modifying the default views that you see to make this information more valuable to you. Okay, so let's get into editing timesheets. So if we want to come back up here to time, we can click on timesheets. We can go to, if we're just editing current time, we don't need to see last pay period's time or the upcoming pay period that's happening starting at the end of the month. We can just simply go to current. And we'd be looking at just my current timesheet. Basically the same process as the all timesheets, but I've cut off the other two. So the default view is going to show like this for you and for the list of employees that are assigned to you. And from here, we can begin to make changes. We can add more information out front here if we wanted to see that for employees. Or if we're going to make changes to a one person's timesheet, we can go to the pencil and go into the edit timesheet mode. And this is where we can begin to make changes to the timesheet based on what's needed. So this might be an employee who forgot to punch in or punch out, a certain type of admin leave that isn't applied to everybody. So if your office ran out of water today and everyone was sent home early, you may have time approved, admin leave approved for that period of time. And so we can come here and make that change to add time. So it started on the first day of the pay period. You can click the calendar to pick whatever day. So if we went to the current day, we can see for me the time I've punched in this morning. And for some reason at 1 p.m., finance office or the admin building doesn't have water or electricity or whatever it is that may say that we need to go home early today, we can make the adjustment to add that time. So it's as simple as clicking the plus button if we needed to add more lines than what's there. And so my timesheet might look something like this, where if we ran out of water, maybe we all left at noon. And so now I need to come back as the timekeeper or the supervisor and make an adjustment to the timesheet for admin leave. Simple as punching in the hours, one that's going to be relevant to us. But how do we tell that this is admin leave? And we have this column here that says time off. If we leave it blank, it's going to show us regular hours worked. And this 1 to 5 today was the approved admin leave because of something that happened within the building. We can go to this drop-down box, and depending on if you've used this before, you may have a small list of the types of time offs that you've picked before. Or this might be blank or missing some of the other types. So not all available types of time off is going to be listed here yet. You can go to Browse, and from here is where you'll have all the available time off types. And as you use them, it'll populate that drop-down box out in the timesheet field. So you can scroll through to find the type of leave that would match the best case of what it is. So if it's admin leave, I have admin picked, and now we know that the 1 to 5 period for 4 hours of time would be for admin leave. Make that adjustment to the timesheet, and then we can save that and move on. And so that's how we would add time. And again, that's any type of time off that's been assigned to the employee. There's different types of time off. You know, I'm not a Head Start employee, so Head Start has some other categories available to them. So as they browse, they may see that here with that to select from. So it all depends on the employee and the type of leave that's assigned to them. But this is how we would add the admin leave. If we're making an adjustment to time off or punching in and punching out, that can be made here. On Monday, I had punched in at 12:55 after taking the morning off of work. And the calculation for my day had it so that it started a lunch hour when I punched in. So from 12:55 to 1:55, it said I was on a lunch hour. And so my hours calculated for the afternoon was 3 hours of work. And so Frida came to edit the timesheet basically and move my punch in time from 12:55 to 1 p.m. and away that 1 hour unpaid lunch went. So here's where you modify those times. One thing we want to be careful with on doing this is we shouldn't be adjusting people's timesheets to add annual leave or sick leave, that type of leave. If I use this to add annual leave to say, today LJ took from 1 to 5 annual leave and then save this, it could end up bypassing what my actual balances are. So if I actually only had 2 hours of annual leave available to be used, by editing the timesheet in this manner, we're skipping that verification process that happens with using our leave, creating a scenario that can cause me to go into negative leave balances, and eventually that becomes an audit finding because now we don't have an actual request of time happening. It's just an edit onto a timesheet, causing a problem for us or for our grant funds, that type of deal. So when we're editing the timesheet here, we'd want to make sure we're editing the punch in or punch out time that we need to address. Someone forgot to punch in, or like for me, the rounding of time didn't work out, so Frida had to correct the time I punched in so the hour lunch wouldn't calculate. Or for these special instances of leave, like the admin leave or the inclement weather, things like that that affect us. Those are the things we're going to edit on time here, not for the accrued leave or sick leave. And then you can just hit the trash can if you're getting rid of a line. So the next part we'll talk about is splitting time entries. So if we were looking at my timesheet for the day and we see LJ was punched in from 7:20 to 5, I'm getting paid from our disbursement account, programs finance, and our funding source is the finance funding source. But if I'm actually getting paid for multiple sources of funds, I would have a responsibility as the timekeeper to make sure that's represented on a timesheet. So we have a question about rounding increments of time. No, on my timesheet for the rounding part, so we say I punch in at 7:25. That's not going to calculate to an even amount of time for raw hours. The raw hours is our actual amount of time spent on the clock, not the actual amount of time we're getting paid. So in my particular profile for finance employees, it doesn't matter how early I punch in, it's going to round my time to 8 a.m. regardless. So my raw hours may say 54.33, but if today was the end of payday or the pay period, I'm getting paid for 48 hours. It doesn't matter what this said. And we'll go backwards and look at an entry like from yesterday. So if we're looking at wanting to split this time because I'm getting paid from finance, maybe from the first half of the day. On the second half of the day, I'm working in a different program or doing a different job. We'd want to see that and show that on a timesheet to properly account for my time as to where I'm working. So we might add our second line of entry here. We have our 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. time. So from 7:25 to 12 p.m., I was on the clock for finance. The second half of the day, maybe I work in personnel. So how am I going to make that change to show on my timesheet that I'm working at personnel? We're going to have to edit this cost center here. So what we do is we're going to go to the funding source area first and click the drop-down box. If you've used it before, like I have, there's going to be a list of funding sources available to you, or we're going to have to click browse. And it's going to take us to a list of all the funding sources. It's somewhere between 1,700 and 1,800 in Workforce Go. And the way it works here is you as a user have access to the ability to pick from any one of these funding sources. Doesn't matter if you're in the treaty office, enrollment office, Head Start, you could see this entire list of funding sources available to pick from. So that can make it pretty hard to find the funding source we're looking for. So if we're looking to assign this other 4 hours of time to a different funding source, one, we need to be prepared with knowing what is the funding source name, so we can do that. And the second part of it is how do we navigate Workforce Go to find that funding source? So kind of back to the report building aspect of this. There's an ability to search this column, the full name of this cost center. It has its defaults to starts with. but I could use like, which is basically like a wild card is what it is. And if I typed personnel and hit enter, it does a quick search for any of these full names that have the word personnel in the funding source. And so now I see 3 of them. Or sorry, I see 4 of them. Do I see the one I want to use? So if it's that funding source, I've now picked that. So now I know that my 1 to 5 hours are going to get charged to this fund. And now I need to change the program, which is basically the exact same steps I've just done. Doing the drop-down box, I'm clicking browse. There's a lot less programs than there are funding sources, so they're in alphabetical order. You could click through each of these pages until you find the program that you're using to assign it to. Or we can select like, type part of the word we're looking for, and then see that. And so now if we're splitting the time for me on Friday, April 23rd, I'm working 8 to 12 in finance and 1 to 5 in personnel. My timesheet now shows that appropriately, and I can click save and move on. So if we need to be accountable to our grants or our funding sources for time that our staff is working through different funding sources, this is how we represent that on our timesheet. There are alternative methods that we can use. For example, the tribal council people get paid half of their pay from general fund and half of their pay from indirect costs. So they have what's called a labor distribution applied to them. And so that no matter what, every pay period, half of their pay goes to general, half of their pay goes to indirect. And if they had timesheets, it wouldn't matter what their timesheet said. It's splitting 50 to 50 no matter what. So labor distributions can be used to help manage how our pay is going when it's needed. And that's the program monitor that establishes those, typically based on your PAs. So another question we have is about manually keeping track of employees' leave balances. In the reports training I do, that's something I actually cover. Workforce Go, and specifically Tony at Personnel, accrues the leave through Workforce Go so that it's automatically tracked for staff. So that's why you're able to go to your menu, go to My Info, and then look up your own leave under time off and see what your balances are. So the time entries can be split for many different purposes, whether it's we're splitting it between funding sources, through programs, checkbooks, that kind of stuff. And this is particularly needed whenever a labor distribution doesn't apply, or our grants need for us to account specifically the hours of time that we're working towards a specific grant or project. And so in those cases, we're going to be responsible for coming in here, making updates to someone's timesheet to properly account for that time. One of the things that can help us manage or make our lives a little easier is, we've seen here, when we're going to browse our funding sources to assign pay to a certain period of time to a certain funding source, that can be an onerous task because there are more than 1,000 funding sources. And so that can become difficult. You have to become a master at knowing the name of the funding sources your employees are getting charged from. You have to be comfortable with coming into Workforce Go, knowing how to edit the timesheet, knowing how to go to funding source and then browse the list of funding sources to either painstakingly go through page after page or to use the filters to find the fund that you'd want to use. Those are all options. And I think for the most part, that's pretty much how everyone is designed as an employee right now. But there are other options. The program monitor has the ability to create a profile for you for any of your employees, where it's called a cost center list. And so they can use that to predetermine if your employees only get paid from 2 or 3 funding sources or whatever that is. They can create a list that limits it to you just seeing those 3 funding sources, whatever's applicable to you. So that when you do come here to browse, whatever's in that limit list, you would only see those to choose from. So that would help reduce the headaches for you for having to edit timesheets, reduce the potential mistakes out there where if I was going to choose from personnel, there's 4 funding sources there. And so if I accidentally picked the 3rd one instead of the 4th one, I might not notice that change happened and then send the timesheet through, and then it gets charged to the wrong funding source. And then everyone begins the pointing fingers of whose fault that is. So we can work with our monitors to create a profile for staff that limits the cost centers you have to choose from. The same thing on programs. They can choose something called a route, so that if only the finance program should be selectable, it would preclude everything else and only make finance available. And then the same thing on the checkbooks. We have like 100 checkbooks. So there's a lot of combinations of things in your timesheet that can be picked that can kind of send you going in the wrong direction. And there's things out there that can help limit those mistakes and limit us to just those things that we should be getting paid from. But that requires, for that to actually have to be done. Otherwise, like we see on my profile, every single checkbook, every single program, and every single funding source is selectable for my timesheet. And then we had the question earlier about the rounding of time. So this is my time from yesterday. I was on the clock from 7:33 until 5:04. My profile has it that no matter what time I punch in before 8 a.m., it's going to round my time to 8 a.m. It doesn't recognize the punches before. Same thing with punching out late. Regardless of the time after 5, when my time gets calculated, it's only going to recognize hours working from 8 to 5. So if we go to the calculated detail for me for yesterday, my raw hours are 9.5 hours. I was on the clock for 9.5 hours yesterday. But once Workforce Go calculated my time, it recognized from 8 to 12 for those first 4 hours. My lunch was processed from 12 to 1. That's an unpaid lunch hour. So that calculation doesn't happen. And then from 1 to 5 for the end of the day, that was calculated at 4 hours. So even though I was on the clock for 9.5, Workforce Go calculated me as working for a total of 8 hours. So as we're adjusting people's time or looking at our employees' timesheets, that doesn't have to be adjusted in those instances where you're rounding just to make it even Otherwise, for my timesheet, every pay period, the supervisor would be going through to say, let's get LJ, let's not represent that he punched in at 7:29. It needs to show 8 o'clock just to be round. And so for those you don't need to worry about. And yes, if you punched in after 8, I forget what the number of minutes as it is that the allowance is put in for. If, Tony, if you know that answer, can you put that in the chat box? But if you punch in at, like, I'm pretty sure 8:05, say, your time will run back to recognize as 8 hours as the processing time. So even though you were late to work, it's going to calculate that time as starting at 8. So that's something to be mindful of when you're looking at that or into consideration. But, we don't need to be working these raw hours out to be even to match the actual calculated hours. All right. So we're going to now get into navigating and looking at mass edits, and two of them in particular. So if you haven't used the mass edit functionality before, we're going to come back up here to the left side corner of your menu. And we have those 4 options for us. Mass editing doesn't take place anywhere near the timesheets. It actually takes place on this little wheel. So if we hover over it, you can see the little admin pop up. And you're going to have an option, or I think we all do, that says mass edit on the menu. So you don't have to expect to see all the options I have on my menu, but we'll all have this option that says mass edit. And we open that. There's other options, but the 2 we're concerned with, or we're going to go through today: mass edit time entries add, mass edit time entries edit. So adding a time entry, when we click on that, and again, I have this defaulted to only show me, but depending on the people you have access to, this list would populate with all those employees. And so the purpose of adding a time entry here is you can do that en masse for a group of people. So if something was wrong with the time clock today, when you come in and it's not accepting anyone's punches, that type of thing, or like the example I gave at the beginning, something happened in the building, water's out, everyone just has to leave. And we might be adding time entries that way because no one punched out, we just told them to go. But if we would have our list of people here, and then from that list, next to everyone's name would be a checkbox. So I'm clicking the checkbox for the one person, and then up here is the checkbox where you can click to choose all the people on your list or just the people on the page. So you can toggle between those 2 options. So I've got the person picked, I've got me picked, and I click mass add time entry. And now we have an option here when editing this time is this a single day edit that we're going to make for people? Is this multiple days? So we can choose one or the other, and then we have a calendar based on those 2 options. So if I choose one day, here's our calendar. What day is it we're going to add a time entry? So I choose today. What is this entry? How much time are we adding to someone's timesheet today? That kind of stuff. So if there was an admin leave for the day, let's, I guess, process it at that. And we wanted to come here and say, we're going to mass edit 8 hours of time onto everyone's timesheet that has been picked. And if it's admin leave, in the next corner up here, we can choose the time off that we need to represent. So we click the magnifying glass. Here's the list of all the time. Admin leave is categorized differently so we can see the plus sign, and then here's the different choices we have. So if there was some circumstance where it was presidential admin leave, you have your memo approving it. I pick that, and now we have that time off picked for April 23rd for 8 hours. And then we click the button up here for add time entries, and Workforce Go would process that, all those entries based on the date, the hours we've put in, and the time off. So, and the same works same for multiple days. What are the dates? So the pay period is April 15th to April 28th. Finance doesn't work on weekends, so we work Monday through Friday. I've got eight hours picked, and up until a month ago, there was the COVID admin leave. So if I had all 25, 26 finance employees picked, I have this done. I could click add time entries, and in one screen, I would have adjusted every single employee's timesheet for COVID admin leave, rather than having to do line by line, day by day for every employee that we supervise or oversee. And so that's mass editing a time entry. One of the other options we have is editing current time entries. So when we come here, we get a list of the employees we have access to. And this one's a little bit different, of course, than just straight up adding a block of time like you could for admin leave. This would be editing what a timesheet says. And so when you come here and you see this list of the employees you have access to, this entry defaults to today. So if we were looking for a day other than today that we needed to mass edit time, we would need to be cognizant of this part first and say, is there a different period of time I want to pick from? Is it a date range? Or do I need to look at a certain pay period? Then I need to choose. So let's just look at the pay period. And so as long as you pick a day within this blue area that it's currently on, it'll just choose this pay period, the current pay period we're on. So I've got apply. And now we would have a list of all of the time entries I have so far this pay period. And if you had all of your employees, you would have all your employees' time entries for the pay period. So I know one of the questions we had on the registration is, how can I see everyone's time at once? This is one of the ways you can do that. But if there was a specific day within this pay period, and going to the example of today, we all got sent home and none of us punched out because there was an issue in the building and we just needed to leave. So we'd want to pick the relevant day, have it on full pay period here. So I want the date maybe just to equal today's date. So we would have that certain date that we filtered to, the list of our employees that we're going to make an entry for. So we would check for those employees. And now when we click mass edit time entry, are we going to adjust the end time, the start time, and then apply that change? So we can do that through our time entries, and then making that change, clicking apply, and then everyone's timesheets would update based on the options we've picked. Now on all of these screens, we have one of these boxes here that's going to give us checkbook, program, funding source. We don't have to worry about any of those things. All the employees already have some of those selected for them. So if you have employees, like if you're in Head Start, there's employees that work for Head Start, some that work for Early Head Start. If you picked one of those funding sources, but you've had people who work on both Head Start and Early Head Start, and we picked one of those funding sources, it's going to override their Head Start setting. if we picked an early Head Start fund. So we probably want to be clear of leaving this stuff blank and just making the changes we need to make to those hours, to the days, and if in the case of time off, choosing a group of time off. And at the beginning, I talked about editing timesheets and staying away from editing accrued leave or sick leave. So we can request, or we should be requesting on behalf of staff if they're not already making the request in Workforce Go themselves. We can go to the team tab, and let me bring the menu back to closed here. And we have this time off submenu, and we can request. So this is requesting time on behalf of someone on our team. So I click request. Who's the employee that we're going to make the request for? So we have a profile that's called auditor. Time off type, we're requesting annual leave for that employee. Now we can start the request, and it looked like for any of us who've completed this type of request before, now we can go into making those requests. Full day, multiple days, is it a partial day? And filling that in for the employee rather than editing on time. That way it'll help us avoid any potential situation where if this employee auditor didn't have enough time for today to have 8 hours of leave taken, and we process that, then we would get the decline that says that this would result in them having a negative balance or whatever the message is from Workforce Go. So then we would know what we need to do next. If we edited the time, we wouldn't know that. So this helps us avoid those issues and make sure that we're properly tracking and using people's leave. So in there was a couple of questions more about leave balances and time clocks. If you have questions about time clock maintenance, that should be addressed to the IT department. They can answer those questions. And for your leave balances, you can address those to your supervisor, and then the personnel office can help address those with you as well. Another question we had on the registration was one, about how to see everybody's time at once rather than going one by one or looking at the days. Like we do, like in the first initial timesheet view, we just see the summary. The mass edit view, we can get a better picture of everyone's time. But there's also a page under the team tab. If we go to time, there's an area down below in the time area that says reports. Calculated time and detailed calculated time. So when we come here, again, I have it defaulted to me. You would have a list of your people for today, what the timesheet looks like. So if you wanted to see everyone's timesheet, this is another great spot. You can see I've punched in today. I haven't punched out, so it's still a question mark until that's done. My calculated time isn't showing yet because I haven't ended my day yet, so the Workforce Go can't calculate this yet. So if we change the entry from today to pay period and the current pay period, now we can start to see what the timesheet looks like as Workforce Go is calculating it. And so if on April 20th, for example, here, I was on the clock from 7:29 to 5:01. So we can see that as my raw start and end time. There's my raw hours. And then this column here, calc start and calc end, is calculating my time based on when I punched in, when I punched out, and then the profile assigned to me for calculating my time. So in finance, our time, it doesn't matter that I punched in at 7:29. Workforce Go is going to calculate my time starting at 8 a.m. It doesn't matter that I punched out at 5:01. It's going to calculate my day as ending at 5 p.m. And that's how we get to the calculated hours of 8 for the day rather than getting paid for 9.5. So you can come here and look at that. This does group entries by date. So when you come here on this default, it's going to group by workday. So you can always ungroup if you wanted to. So everything crunches together like this. So whatever your choice would be if you're using this kind of report. But this is another good tool in looking at the time entries and calculation for employees. Well, I see no other questions coming in about editing timesheets. There is a question out there for Tony about a grace period. And has the grace period stuff ended, Tony? If you can put that in the chat box. Well, that's all I have, everybody. Thank you for your time today. Enjoy the rest of your day. And when this is ready, I'll email the link to the recording and to the presentation I'm using that has more detailed instruction over the stuff I've gone through. Enjoy the rest of your day. And note the grace period is still there. It's grandfathered in, so it's there. All right. Have a good day.